What's going on? Welcome to our second Flip lecture. This one's going to be about psychological research. I hope you all watched the first one on the history of psychology. These lectures are going to be the main way you're getting content from me. We'll be going over things in class, but this is the main way to get that new content. So make sure you watch the last one, and thank you for watching this one. Make sure you tune in the whole time. Take breaks as you need to. I'm filming this pretty early, before school's even started, so hopefully the things I have to say aren't out of date and things are still going along well as scheduled. So hello to future all of you. Plan today is to talk about how psychologists do research. So to talk about different types of studies psychologists do. We're going to talk about correlation and causation, these two mathy words that are really important in the world of psychology. And get into specifics about how to set up an experiment and how to make sure you're following the ethical guidelines that all psychologists have to follow. So this is our plan for the day. As you're taking notes, make sure that you go ahead and do the Roman numerals. Write down the bold and underline things as we go in your notes so that you'll have all that content when you need it throughout the year when you're studying for your quizzes and your tests, and also in May for that AP exam. So to start off, Roman numeral number 1, this is just an introduction to how psychologists do research. So psychology studies, okay? There are two main types of studies that psychologists do. Okay, there's correlational research, that's one type of study, and then there are experiments, okay? Correlational studies and experiments. We're going to start off by talking about correlational studies, okay? Correlational studies, the whole purpose of these studies is to determine whether or not two things are associated and related to one another. They determine if there's a relationship between variables. Okay, so I have bulleted for you, correlational studies determine a relationship. We'll do some practice with this as well. Some types of correlational studies, the way you can do correlational research. First, you can just watch people. Any of y'all people watchers? You ever go into the commons or go to the mall and just kind of sit back, or at a park and just kind of watch what people are up to? You are doing psychological research. You are doing what's called naturalistic observation. You're going into nature. You're not interacting with those individuals, those people, those groups. You're just sitting back and you are watching and you're taking notes, and you can notice things. I could do a study to find out which lunch period is the messiest. I could just go into the commons after each lunch and I could just look and see how much trash there is. I could count the trash from where I'm sitting. I'm not manipulating the scenario. I'm not interacting with anybody. I'm just watching to see what people do on their own. That's naturalistic observation, and that's a form of correlational research. You could also do surveys. You are not manipulating or influencing people when you're doing a survey, hopefully, but you are collecting lots of data. This might be a questionnaire, like the SEI surveys they make you do every single year. This could be a self-report. It could be based on an interview, but surveys are all about collecting data. 1 second. Computer was about to die. We got that fixed. I think we're good to go. So second thing, surveys. Third thing, another form of correlational study is called a case study. A case study is when you examine a single case, one person, or like maybe one class of people or one group of people, okay? And the deal with case studies is you're still not supposed to be influencing these individuals. None of these are experiments, right? These are all correlational studies. But with a case study, you go in depth, in detail. So if someone has like an interesting story or a unique case, or if they're the first person to have experienced something, you want to interview them, maybe take a deep look at their life, maybe over a long period of time, their history, to learn as much as you can about them, with the hope that what you learn about them can apply to other people, okay? That we can apply that, we can generalize it to other people. That might be a good word for you to write down, generalize. We take what we learn about one person and we assume, we hope, we think, we hypothesize that maybe it's true about other people as well. We're going to go over these in class together, hopefully, next time we're together, Wednesday, Thursday. But there's 6 scenarios here, 6 different types of studies or types of research that an individual could do. And I want you to kind of think to yourself, is this a case study? Is this naturalistic observation? Or is this an experiment? Okay, so like, I'll do number 1 with you. Mr. Jones sits down with a student for several hours to ask about that student's success in class, so that Mr. Jones can develop strategies so that others can succeed in AP psychology. What type of research would Mr. Jones be doing? Well, that's a case study. It's with a single individual, a single subject, and it's in depth, it's in detail, with the hope that I can learn things from this one person that will apply to others. You can do the rest of these on your own, and we'll go over them together in class. So let's dive a little deeper into like, okay, what happens once you do your research? Once you count the trash in the lunchroom, or once you sit down with the student and learn about their strategies? Well, psychologists like to graph the data. Okay, so this is some mathy stuff here, so just hang with me, all right? Correlation coefficients. You can actually put a number on how related two things are. This is represented by the letter R, just a lowercase r. Now, R stands for your correlation coefficient, okay? R, correlation coefficient. It's always between -1 and 1. It could be a decimal, it could be 0. Now, strong correlations are really close to 1 or really close to -1, okay? So what we have down here on the bottom are 7 possible graphs with data. And what it shows you is that depending on how aligned the data is, how strong the data is, like imagine if you were to draw a best fit line through each of these clouds, if that best fit line tracks perfectly with the data, that means this is a strong correlation, close to 1. This is also a strong correlation. Even though it's a negative slope, still a very strong correlation, meaning these two variables are super related. Now, if you have two variables that are not that related, your correlation coefficient, your R value, is going to be closer to 0, right? These two things aren't related. This just looks like a random cloud of dots, right? This is a 0.4, a -0.4, not as related as a -0.8, or the most perfectly correlated, a -1 or a +1. So the closer to 0 a correlation coefficient is, the weaker it is. The closer to 1 or -1, the stronger it is. So here are some graphs just to kind of help you visualize this in an actual setting with actual variables. Up here you have a chart that they took, each dot represents a person, and they tried to determine how much the people weighed and how tall they were. And what you see here is a pretty positive slope. This would be an R value of 0.8 or 0.9. It looks like these things are related. That makes sense. Someone who is taller is probably also going to weigh more because there's just more of them, right? Now, it's not a perfect correlation. We could have tall, skinny people, right? Or we could have tall, less skinny people. But for the most part, these two variables are related. Okay, here's another one where it looks like these two variables are related. How many hours of sleep you got the night before and how tired you are. Hours of sleep and tiredness. We see this as a negative slope, meaning if you have lots of sleep, you're going to be really tired. As your hours of sleep go down, that increases your tiredness here on the x-axis. So this is a pretty strong correlation as well. This would be like a negative, I don't know, 0.7, negative 0.8. Pretty correlated, pretty associated, but in a negative direction. Over here on the top right, hours of sleep you have gotten correlated with your shoe size. This graph looks super random. Each dot still represents a person, but there are some people who have smaller shoe sizes that got medium sleep or lots of sleep or very little sleep. There's some folks with larger shoe sizes that got lots of sleep and a little bit of sleep and medium sleep. There's no correlation, there's no relationship and association in this data set between hours of sleep and shoe size, okay? So these are just 3 examples of the ways that we can use correlation. So, something that you should be able to do if you need to. You might have to do this on a free response at some point this year. You should be able to, if I give you these 5 scenarios, draw your own scatter plot, kind of sketch out where the best fit line would be, and then estimate where the correlation coefficient would be between -1 and 1, okay? So some of these is your opinion. Some of these is probably pretty clear to say. So like, let's look at number 3, the height a person has and their SAT scores. Are those things related? Probably not, right? How tall you are does not impact how you're going to do in the standardized test. So that's going to have a correlation coefficient closer to 0, okay? If you want to practice, you can do these 5 on your own, and we'll do them in class at some point. We'll talk about these in class, positive, negative, and how strong the correlation is. Roman numeral 3. I've been going over correlational studies, but there is a problem with correlational studies. They're so easy to do, they're so cheap, they're so nice. However, there's a major problem, and I want you to write this down. I want you to star it on your paper. I want you to circle it. If you want to get a tattoo, this would be a great thing to get tattooed. Correlation does not mean causation. Just because 2 things appear, they look like they're associated, does not necessarily mean that one of those things is causing the other. This is a common trap that people fall into, and you'll hear about this throughout your entire life. Just because 2 things appear related does not mean one causes the other. Take a look at this graph, okay? Might be hard to see, but what we have here are a red and a black line. The red line here, this top one with the hill, the red line shows how much mozzarella cheese people have eaten between the year 2000 and 2009. And then the black line shows how many doctorate degrees in engineering people received during the same time frame. We have these two graphs, and these two graphs, these two lines, they look really similar. In fact, if you could zoom in here, it says that the R value is 0.96, so close to +1, meaning there's a really strong relationship between these two variables. Now, what your brain wants to do, your brain wants to assume that one of these things must be causing the other. Maybe eating pizza, eating mozzarella cheese, maybe that makes you a good engineer. Or maybe on the flip side, you're thinking to yourself, no, I bet that engineers eat lots of mozzarella cheese. And that's why these lines are so similar. In reality, these things could just be random coincidences. Okay? Sometimes things are similar. Things look like there's causation when there's really not. Correlational studies cannot determine causation. When we falsely assume that two things are so correlated that one's causing the other, we call this a spurious correlation. It's a misleading correlation. It is false. Okay? Something else might be going on here, so be aware of that. I love this cartoon. This first person says, I used to think that correlation implied causation, right? Just because two things are correlated, that means that one is causing the other. And the person says, then I took a statistics class, and now I don't think that way anymore. And this other individual says, well, it sounds like the class helped. And this person, they know their statistics. They say, well, maybe. You can't assume that correlation means causation. Okay, it was a nerdy joke. I don't think anyone's laughing, but I thought it was pretty clever, personally. You got to be careful about this, because if you assume that correlation means causation, this one here says it's the number of people who drowned by falling into a swimming pool, and it's correlated with the number of films Nicolas Cage has appeared in, right? If you think that correlation assumes causation, you might think that things are related that really aren't, okay? So if we ever really want to find out causation, Roman numeral 4, you have to do an experiment. Experiments are the only way to show cause and effect, and they will ask you about that on the AP exam. It will be on quizzes, it will be on tests, okay? How do we design experiments? Well, they have to have good design, and they have to be ethical. We're gonna spend some time talking about how we design experiments first. So Roman numeral number 5, when you're designing an experiment, you have to set up your experiment in such a way that other folks can come along after you, and they can do the exact same experiment. This is so important right now in the world. Folks are throwing around lots of information about coronavirus. And if you really want to trust a study, trust an experiment, you want the researcher to explain so perfectly what they did in their study that another researcher, another doctor, another scientist could try to do the exact same study. We call this replicability. It means that someone can repeat your experiment. So how do we do this? Well, when you're talking about an experiment, you have to very clearly explain exactly what you mean by the words you're using, by the variables you're using, right? When I talked earlier about height being related to SAT score, I need to explain, what do I mean by height? How am I measuring that? Is that centimeters? Is that inches? Is that with shoes on? Is it with shoes off, right? Are we counting the hair or no? Similarly, with SAT scores, what do I mean by SAT score? Do I mean the total score, the super score, the best score in a single sitting? Am I just talking about a particular subtest of the SAT score? Like what year? Was it the same test? You have to explain it so that other folks can do the same experiment and get the same results. That's how we know an experiment is truly reliable and valid, okay? So you want to be as specific as possible with your operational definitions. And operational definitions, you're just defining, you're explaining how you operated, how you ran your experiment. So there's a couple checks for I'm saying here's some practice you could do. This first scenario is about 2 roommates, and one of them says, I can't stand living this way. That's not specific. What do you mean by that? So we're going to talk about this in class. Here's another one. It's about a little girl at a daycare, and the daycare worker tells the parents that little Emily is slow. No, don't tell a parent their kid is slow. You have to give specific example. What do you mean by that? What have you been measuring, right? Be precise and be specific, so that we can look for improvements, we can look for changes over time. That's what operational definitions is all about. How are you going to measure that thing? What do you mean when you're describing your variables? So we'll talk about these in class. Continuing on some other elements of experimental design. Roman numeral 6. We have 7 Roman numerals, so we're almost through. This is a long one, but we're almost through. Okay? So the first 2 things, your independent variable and dependent variable. I know you've talked about this in science classes throughout your life. An independent variable, I always do this thing with my hand, because when I think about independent variable, I think about the variable that is manipulated, that is changing. So for me, when I do this, it's just a habit. I'm thinking about changing, okay? The thing the researchers are purposefully manipulating or tweaking or changing to see what happens. The dependent variable is, what's the result? What happens next? What's the outcome? What is being measured, okay? So the IV and the DV. So some practice for you. I got 4 scenarios here. The first one says, the score on a test is dependent on the time you spent studying. That makes sense. That's a cool conclusion. So what is causing what to change? Well, the independent variable is the thing that's making the dependent variable change. The independent variable is the thing you have control over, the thing you can manipulate and change. So in this scenario, the time spent studying causes the test score to change. So the independent variable would be studying time, and the dependent variable will be test score, okay? I encourage you to do these other 4. We'll go over them together in class. But if you want to pause this and work on these, make sure you understand independent and dependent variable. It'll be on your test. It could be on the AP exam. Other elements of good experiments, the control group and an experimental group, okay? You don't want to just mess with somebody, mess with some of your subjects and find out what happens, because you have no control, meaning you don't know what would have happened if you hadn't gotten involved, okay? I want you to imagine that I have a cactus, okay? And one person waters the cactus a little bit every day. And at the end of a month, they say, wow, my cactus is still alive, it's doing well. Looks like water makes the cactus survive. It helps the cactus live. Do we really know that the water helped the cactus live? No, we don't, because there was no control group. What we should have, we're gonna do this experiment, we should have 2 cacti, the exact same, type of cactus, and one cactus we should give no water. One cactus we should maybe water every day. And at the end of the month, we'll see which cactus is doing better. That would be a good experiment, because we have a control group, a cactus, a group, an individual that we are not messing with, that we are not altering or manipulating in any way whatsoever. Your experimental group is the group that you are manipulating, the group that you are giving the water to, or in a medical study, the group that gets the new drug or the new treatment, okay? If we change too much in an experiment, right? So if we have one cactus that we do nothing to, and then we have another cactus that we give fertilizer and water every day, and we sing to it, and we move it around to the sun based on how the sun moves throughout the day. At the end of my month, if that second cactus is taller and healthier, do I know what led to it being taller and healthier? Do I understand what caused what? No. It could have been the sunlight, it could have been the water, it could have been the fertilizer, it could have been the singing. We don't know. So if you change too many variables, we call that confounding variables. We don't want confounding variables, okay? We want to have controls, because that really allows us to figure out what is causing what is making what happen. That's what good experiments do. So some practice for you. 3 little experiments that I made up here. These are not great experiments necessarily, but your job in this experiment is to identify what's the control group, experimental group, the independent and dependent variable, what's confounding, what should be kept constant, and what might be bad about this experiment. So I have one here about Michael and his dogs. I have one about Johnny throwing a football. I have one here about Jimmy celebrating a touchdown here. So if you want to go through those, we'll go over them in class together. Oh, here's another great little check for understanding here for you. It's based on SpongeBob. And I really love this one, specifically what SpongeBob's conclusions should be. So we'll talk about this as well. Other things you need to have in a good experiment. You don't want to just have your best friend in the study, or you don't want to just have 16-year-old females in your study, right? You want to have a random sample. Okay, this is bolded, it's underlined, make sure you write this down. Put a star actually by these 2 terms, because folks get them confused and they're often on that AP exam. So the sample, the selection, the study, all these words start with S. It's just, who are you studying? Who is in your research project? Now, once they're in your research project, you don't want to put, I don't know, let's say that we're doing a study where I think that pizza makes your grades better, right? It would not be fair if I put all the AP students in the pizza group and all the students who are taking CP psychology, if I put them in the non-pizza group. That wouldn't be a fair study, because the pizza group might score higher, but it's not because of the pizza. It's because they just came in, they just happen to be a really strong group of students. So we have to do, not only do we want a random sample to be in the study, But once people are in the study, the second part is that we need to randomly assign them to a group, the pizza group or the non-pizza group, the control group. And that lets us know that there's no other confounding variables, there's no bias occurring here. This is how we do a really good study. Okay. This is a little cartoon here. The guy says, there's a flaw in your experimental design. All the mice are Scorpios. Are any of y'all Scorpios? I can't tell if you're raising your hand, it's a video, but this would be kind of going a little bit overboard with trying to have a random sample, right? But it is important to make sure that all folks from the community, from the population, are in your study to have a representative sample. Once again, so that when you get results, you're going to be able to apply it, and here's that word again, generalize your results to the entire community. Random samples and random assignment. Another phrase that we use, especially when we're talking about medical studies, is you don't want anyone to mess up your experiment. You don't want any bias to impact your results. So the best experiments, especially when we're talking about medical studies, if we're trying out a new drug or a new treatment, okay, it's not good if the patient knows they're getting the drug or the placebo. Say placebo, it's a fun word. A placebo, in studies sometimes it'll be like a sugar pill, or it'll be like a random tablet that doesn't actually have any drugs inside of it. What they do is they give all the patients a tablet to take every morning, because sometimes they've shown that if people think they're getting treatment, it actually makes them feel better. That doesn't help us if we want to know if a drug is effective. We want to know, did the drug make them better? So in a double-blind experiment, the researchers won't know who's getting the treatment, and neither will the participants, right? Maybe they get a code name or an ID number instead, and the doctors and participants don't find out. Now, if the doctors know about the treatment and the participants don't, that would be a single blind study, or vice versa. The participants know they're getting treatment and the doctors don't know, that's a single blind experiment. One of the groups is blind to who is in which group, the control or the experimental. If nobody knows who's in which group, we call it a double-blind experiment. It's the best kind of study. And at the end of the experiment, at the end of the research, you'll go back and figure out who is in which group, and then you can run the math to try and figure out, was this treatment, was this drug, was this independent variable actually effective in a statistically significant way? I'm not throwing a lie at y'all, but you're doing great. Hang on in there. If you need a break, take a break, okay? So this double-blind study, right, we have two patients. You can't tell, they're blindfolded. They don't know whether they're getting the regular pills or the placebo pills. And then the doctor also doesn't know. Hopefully the doctor's not actually blindfolded. It's a metaphor. Another cartoon for you. Do a double-blind test. Give the new drug to rich patients and a placebo to the poor. No sense getting their hopes up. They couldn't afford it even if it works. That's dark. First off, would that be a double-blind test? No. The researchers know who's getting which drug, which treatment. Second thing, is this random assignment? Are they randomly choosing who's getting what? No. This would be non-random assignment. If they give the rich people the drug and the poor people get a placebo, a harmless fake pill, that is not random assignment. This is not going to be a good study. This is a major design flaw, and it also has some ethical problems. Good morning. Here's your placebo. I mean medicine. Well, I'm fired. Was this a double-blind study? No. This person knew that this was a placebo for this patient, right? And they just revealed it. So this was a single-blind study. The patient wasn't supposed to know what they were getting, and now it's not even a single-blind study, and this person will get fired for having messed up this entire study. We'll check for understanding, something you could do. Try and create your own experiment, right? Think about how you design, if you wanted to see like whether name brand Coca-Cola is actually better than like a generic store brand version of Coca-Cola. What would we do at Lanier High School? We're gonna try and make a study. How can we make sure that we have all of this? Some of your free responses, it's gonna be you designing an experiment, creating your own experiment, and you have to be able to apply these terms, explain what they mean, and then show how you could make sure you have random assignment. You know, maybe you're drawing names out of a hat for who's in which group. Make sure, what do you mean by Coca-Cola? Is it a can? Is it a bottle? How cold is it? How are you serving it? Is it on ice? How much of it are they getting, right? You have to be very specific about what you mean by Coca-Cola or what you mean by tastes good, right? You should be able to identify independent, dependent variables, confounding variables, and design a good study. And this is what good psychologists do. Our last segment for today's lecture is just about ethics. Everything we've been talking about up until now wasn't really about ethics necessarily. It was more about how you design a study. Is it a well-designed study? You're going to get good results that are valid and reliable. There is one more concern though. Sometimes you'll design a good experiment and it will be unethical, okay? So ethical problems are like moral problems. There are 6 things that psychologists have to make sure they do, okay? And I remember this, it's stupid, but I remember this with these letters, CCDDPP, CCDDPP. So the first C stands for confidentiality. Anybody who's in a psychological study, they get to have their information kept private and confidential. They're not gonna be put on blast. It's not gonna go out to the public. Only the researchers will know that, and the researchers will protect their privacy. Confidentiality. The second C, consent. You can't force somebody to be in a psychological study. They have to know what they're doing and agree to take part, okay? The 2 Ds stand for debriefing. If in a study, if you get complicated results or worrisome results, right? Or if you trick someone while you were in the study, which is this next D, deception. If you deceive somebody along the way, which try not to, but you are, in some studies, you just have to deceive someone. You have to give them a placebo, or you have to trick them about what the study is about to see their natural results. At the end of the study, you have to debrief them. Explain to them exactly what the study was really about and what the results were. So debrief, and then if you deceive folks, it needs to be harmless, revealed, and it has to be necessary for your results. The final 2 things in the ethics. Along the way, participants should be protected from harm. Can participants be challenged, be stressed, be uncomfortable? Yes, but you don't want there to be any long-term emotional, mental, or physical harm. So psychologists have to design things. You can't, for a psychological study, you can't just give someone a life-threatening illness, right? You can't lie to people and induce what would be PTSD, right? You can't make them go through a traumatic event just to see what would happen to them. That would be unethical because you're not protecting your participants. Finally, if someone has consented to be in your study and you're trying to protect them, at any point, a participant still has the opportunity and the option to leave. So just say, you know what, I don't want to do this anymore, whether it's because they're uncomfortable or they just don't feel like being in the study or the timing doesn't work for them. At any point in the experiment, the participant has the right to leave. That's an ethical thing. You want to make sure that the participants know they have the freedom to decide how long they want to participate, okay? So we'll talk about different famous studies that have been done. We're going to talk about some studies that maybe had really good design, but were not very ethical. Okay? So hopefully this made sense for you. If you have questions, send me an email, and we'll talk about this in class Wednesday, Thursday. Appreciate you all. Okay?